Let me tell you a little bit about the author first. Dr. Artie Six Killer Clarke holds degrees in history, English, psychology and educational leadership and has a background as a teacher, university professor, administrator, licensed therapist and social science researcher. As a professor emeritus at Montana State University and director of the Center for Bilingual Multicultural Education, Dr. Clarke conducted research about encounters with UFOs and star people among indigenous peoples throughout the world. She's author of two bestsellers, Sisters in the Blood and Encounters with Star People, Untold Stories of American Indians. Her website is sixkiller.com, provides updates about her activities, and you may contact her at artie@sixkiller.com. Book is fascinating. Dr. Artie Six Killer Clarke, author of this book, Encounters with Star People and Told Stories of American Indians, turns her attention to the examination of role of star travelers, sky gods and UFO among the indigenous people of Central America and Mexico. In Sky People, Untold Stories of Alien Encounters in Mesoamerica. Motivated by a teenage vow to follow in the footsteps of two 19th century explorers, John L. Stevens and Frederick Catherwood, who brought the ancient Maya cities to the world's attention, and are interested in exploring the ancient astronaut theory and ancient legends of the Maya. Dr. Clarke set out on an adventure to take her more than 7 years to complete. During that time, she made her way through Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, following the footsteps of the adventurous duo and collecting stories of encounters with sky gods, giants, little people, aliens among the indigenous people. Without further ado, let's bring on today's guest. Hi, Artie. Welcome to the show.
Hi, James. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here.
Oh, great to hear your voice, Artie. You're situated in Mountain Time. It must be, what, southwest somewhere?
No, Montana.
Oh, Montana. Wow. Beautiful Montana.
Up in the Rocky Mountains.
Wow, you got a wild, rugged terrain up there, Artie.
Yes, it's beautiful, though. It's going to snow tonight. We got a weather warning out.
Yeah, we just hit snow ourselves in Ireland here. It's on and off a little bit, but Artie, I guess tell us a little bit about the bio we don't know about you. Tell us about your passions, your interests. It's always nice to build a picture for the audience of who the person is. And tell us about you, Artie. You've got a diverse educational background, very, very tenacious in your studies.
Well, you know, I've always been an individual that I grew up in poverty, and because of that, I saw the way out of poverty was education. So I was a very studious person and studied and got scholarships and went to the universities and you know, worked part-time jobs, often at 50 cents an hour to help put myself through school. And I've always had a curiosity about the universe from the time I was a child. And Stevens and Catherwood, who motivated my trip to Mesoamerica, was two characters I fell in love with when I was in high school. I had read, a teacher gave me the book Incidents of Travel in Central America, the Chiapas and the Yucatan, by John L. Stevens, and they had gone to that part of the world in the 1800s when no one believed the ancient Maya cities actually existed. In fact, their colleagues discouraged them, made fun of them, ridiculed them for even assuming that there were cities there. But Stevens and Catherwood had heard the rumors, and they decided to head out anyway. And it was a very, very difficult trip. There were no roads, and they had to literally hack their way through jungles in order to discover, or rediscover, I should say, these cities. And I was so taken with their narrative, and when I went back to turn in the book, I said to the teacher, one day I'm going to follow in their footsteps. And she said, well, you might want to read this book. And she handed me their second book, Incidents of Travel in the Yucatan, which was solely about Mexico. Catherwood had become very ill with malaria on their first trip, and Stevens took him back to New York City. And in 1841, they decided to head out for to continue their exploration. And the second book was written. I was more convinced than ever, but, you know, life has a way of getting in the way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
You know, you have to earn a living, and you have to do all of these things as part of growing up and becoming an adult and being a contributing individual. So it really took me a long time before I was able to fulfill my dream. I started out in Belize City, which is where they first landed. But they didn't explore the country of Belize. They simply used that as a stopping off place to rest before they went into Honduras. But I chose Belize and Belize City. I stayed there and explored the country. Belize is an English-speaking country. At the time that Stevens and Catherwood arrived there, it was British Honduras, but they were at war with the Spanish.
Oh, yeah.
Over control of the country. And, of course, Honduras now is Spanish-speaking and Belize is English-speaking. And there was also a civil war going on when they were there. And, of course, what's going on there now is the drug trafficking and tremendous violence against indigenous people and there and in Guatemala. So, you know, it was a different setting, but one that was perhaps as equally dangerous in many aspects. But I was fortunate that I had some wonderful guides, teachers, interpreters, professionals along the way that paved the way for me, introduced me to communities, validated me, served as my go-betweens, and as a result, I was able to write this book. It was a very different experience than when I wrote Encounters with Star People, you know, because I was at home in Native American country, American Indian. But I was a little, it was a little different to go among the Maya and the Zapotec, the Mixtec in Mexico. So it was truly one of the most wonderful experiences anyone could ever have, but it was also an experience that made an indelible mark upon me as an individual.
Well, you know, 7 years conducting UFO research in Mesoamerica, you know, that's quite prolific. That's not a walk in the park, Gardy.
Oh, it is. And, you know, I had to devote myself to it because otherwise, you know, I just, it was just something that kept drawing me in and, you know, continuing on with not giving up. And it was a wonderful experience.
Was there any barriers when you were there trying to encounter people and stories and stuff like that and collect the data?
I think the biggest barrier, of course, is always language.
Oh, yeah.
You know, before I went there, I did an extensive search for drivers and guides who could assist me. And one of the things that I required of all the people who work with me was fluency in English and in Spanish. And I also wanted people who were fluent in a Mayan dialect. There are several dialects of the Maya language. And so I wanted somebody who could speak to the native people in their native language. And it took some doing, but after about a year, I was able to find the people I needed that could help me along the way. So that was the biggest barrier. The cultures obviously are different. Mayan culture is men and women play different roles than American Indians, I think. It's the women are shyer and less reluctant to speak. So those are barriers I had to overcome. And then, you know, here I am, you know, a gringa coming into that part of the world, and of course Americans have to be very careful,
sure.
That you're not observed as some rich, American coming in and
rich pickings.
And so that meant that I had to, be one of the people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So for the large part, Artie, were you on your own traveling and then just taking guides as you need be?
Well, I always, except in Honduras, I always had someone with me.
Mm.
I was taken into Honduras by a driver, and then I just stayed in that village. But then a driver from Guatemala came and picked me up. But when I was in Guatemala, I was pretty much on my own. Honduras. But the rest of the places, I was always accompanied by someone, like a driver. Obviously to get around, I needed someone to drive me, and I was not brave enough to drive myself.
Oh yeah.
Because I felt I really needed that, because many of the places I went to were extremely isolated, and some of the areas I went to were, had drug cartels.
Sure.
Operating. I was often stopped by military and searched. Sometimes I was stopped by the federal police. Mm-hmm. So, that was a necessity in order to accomplish what I was doing.
Respect to Mesoamerica, not really picking any country in particular, but how did you find the native peoples there? Were they all very friendly, open, absolutely. Nice people?
Extremely humble people who know how to survive and know how to live.
Yeah.
They grow their own food. They have little, because of the climate there, you could have multiple growing seasons.
Oh yeah.
And so, they plant a crop, and when that one comes to maturity, they start another crop, and it's one of these kinds of things where they can feed themselves. Mm-hmm. Most of the people that I met had not only their little gardens with corn and peppers, but they also had abundant fruit trees, chickens, turkeys, pigs in the backyard. That's just the way they live. And so they are self-sufficient and can live with hardly any material things. Their little houses are probably the size of my bathroom. Mm-hmm. The floors are earth.
Sure.
They can make their houses out of things that are available around them, or many of them use cinder block. Still use traditional kinds of roofs in many of the homes. The palapa, it's a fern, or not a fern, some kind of a tree that grows in the forest that they make their roofs out of.
Gotcha.
So, they can live quite cheaply in most of these villages.
Mm. Wow. And just trying to build a picture for the audience as well here, Artie. I'm going to get to the UFO material, obviously, or extraterrestrial phenomena. And just trying to build a picture. It must be quite satisfying to go there, as contrary to the book and the research, as like a side adventure, just being there and being in that environment and getting to know the people and getting to kind of feel the terrain. That must be quite a little bit of an adventure in itself, Artie.
Well, it was adventurous, but I never went any place that I didn't feel welcome. People were so humble and so welcoming, and but I expected that, because that's the way it is among Native Americans. You're always, if you go to someone's house, you're always welcomed in. You're always often offered something, to drink, refreshments, even in the poorest of families. So I kind of expected that kind of reception. Mm-hmm. There's indigenous cultures are quite different from Western cultures, in that there is that trust, that welcoming. particularly once you're introduced by somebody else that says, this person is a good person, this person is okay.
Sure.
Basically, that's all it takes.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
for someone they trust to validate you.
Yeah. Oh, that's a big part of the Irish culture. I know anybody that comes to Ireland, that we just open our doors and say, come and enjoy our lives and enjoy our home. And I know we're renowned around the world for that. So we like to see that when we go away as well. And I know a lot of people speak about Peru like that and Mesoamerica. So, that's what I wanted to build a picture, because, it kind of leads into the extraterrestrial phenomena. Did you encounter openness with the subject matter you were trying to investigate, as well as just the natural of people being open to social interaction? Was it with respect to the information you were looking for? Was there an openness there? Did that openness continue?
Well, once that social interaction or that trust was established, most people were quite open. The majority of them had never told their stories to anyone, or if they had, it was only a select few people. In some cases, I would hear about a story. I would hear that, say, this elder said this happened, and so I would go in search of the elder, and then I would let my driver and my guide, talk to them, and to see if they were open to meeting with me and telling me their stories. Perhaps more, I wasn't able in many cases to bring up the subject. I had to leave it to somebody else.
Mm-hmm.
But where among American Indians, I could just say how many of you have had experiences, or have you ever had an experience, or, I had that intermediary, in many cases. Although, like in Belize, I, had people, who spoke English, who, that wasn't as difficult for me.
Okay. Respect to, obviously, the US has a big culture with these stories, accounts, if you want to call it that, or historical accounts. Do you find similarities there, differences, comparisons?
Well, Mesoamerica has been a place that's been, had a long history of involvement with sky beings. I was up in the state of Oaxaca in Mexico, and 3 young men approached me. I was standing alone overlooking a valley because I was at Monte Alban, which is a Zapotec city high up in the mountains of Oaxaca. These 3 young men approached me with a TV camera and explained that they were university students, and they assumed I was a tourist. And so they came to me and said, we're doing a film on slash burning in the jungles. And slash burning is where the native people will go out into the jungle, and they will cut down the vegetation and plant a garden. And they just felt this was terrible. And of course, it's been going on for centuries in that part of the world, and it's the only way the indigenous people can survive, basically. Mm-hmm. And so they were doing this film, and they wanted to know my opinion. Well, my driver saw them talking to me and rushed over and explained to them that I was not a tourist and that I, didn't have any opinion about any of these things. And as the discussion wore on, they found out what I was doing, and they suggested that maybe they should follow me and film me because what I was doing was more interesting than what they were doing. But over Cokes, we talked about various UFO sightings, and one of the young men told me, he said, there's a village near here that has an ancient story about a man that came on a beam of light and stood in the middle of the town. He arrived in the middle of the town.
Wow.
And he married a native woman. He had a son. He created the city that was built. He taught the people all kinds of things about life and survival. And when his son was old enough and took a wife, he went back to the center of town, and a beam of light came down, and he went back to the sky. And he said, that might be a place you want to look in. So, of course, that's a place I want to look into, you know. So I go there. So many times these kinds of things happen to me. People would find out what I was doing, and then they would say, you know, there's an elder, or there is a shaman. There's somebody out here that knows more than I know, or you want to talk to.
Wow.
So that's how a lot of the things happen.
Wow. Do you believe in the ancient alien hypothesis, the ancient astronaut theory?
No.
No?
Absolutely not. The
Okay.
Maya tell me that they were the ancient astronauts. They came, they built the cities, and they stayed.
Mm-hmm.
At least a large percentage of the people I interview tell me that. No, I think the ancient astronaut theory is ethnocentric. Basically what you're saying are the indigenous people are so stupid that they couldn't possibly have built these ancient cities.
Mm-hmm.
So some mastermind, super being had to come down from the stars and build them for these people. So they couldn't have possibly done this. And that is the old idea of the indigenous people being savages, of not having a culture, of being, you know, all of these things that are wrong with them. It's the same thing, you know, people look upon, have for centuries looked upon indigenous cultures and thought they know more about those cultures than the indigenous people themselves.
Oh, yeah. Look at
I
Egypt.
remember reading an account, for example, that he was an explorer and a trapper, and he wrote about the Plains Indians. And what he observed, he said, the women were the beasts of burdens. They did all the work, and the men didn't do anything. Now, of course, what he's doing is he's taking his culture, he's looking at a foreign culture, and he's decided that the women do all the work and the men don't do anything. What he didn't understand was that in many native cultures, well, in all native cultures, division of work is important. So the culture he was observing, the women were responsible for the home. So they took down the teepee, they put up the teepee. They cooked the meat, they took anything related to the home and children were their responsibility. Anything related to providing the food, such as hunting, and the spiritual needs of the family was the responsibility of the man. But this observer didn't understand that. And it's the same thing with people who come in and say, well, these cities couldn't have been built by Indians. They were too dumb. They were too stupid.
Mm-hmm.
You know, and so I consider those views very ethnocentric. And then not only that, you take somebody who says, well, this is an ancient astronaut right here. King Pakal of Palenque, the ancient astronaut, sitting in his spacecraft.
Mm-hmm.
And I think everyone has seen that probably if they own the internet. And yet, the Maya will tell you it's symbolic of the tree of life. You know, the Maya believe that you go to the underworld, and then you come out of the underworld and you make your way across the Milky Way to Chivalba. And, you know, it's because they don't look at the culture, they don't understand the beliefs of the people. And of course, when they are told those beliefs, like in the case of the Maya, you know, the Catholic priest Landa, you know, he destroyed all the Maya books because the Maya had books. And he burned them all except 3. And so, because he thought they were the work of the devil. So when you have people today, they are no different whenever they co-opt a culture and try to put their own values, their own, but you know, Maya were building cities when Europeans were still living in caves.
True, true.
You know, and so when you think about that, you know, in order to say, hey, these people were amazing, the knowledge they had of the universe, of architecture, of, you know, they had plumbing in their houses, you know, and they had baths, and they had all these things that Europeans didn't have. But so you can't say that these dark-skinned indigenous people were smarter than the Europeans. So what you've got to say is somebody from the skies came down and built their cities because they were so ignorant.
We know they were astronomers, and we know they were engineers, and we know they were architects, and everything in between. That's sure. And like you say, yeah, they were a hydraulic situation.
But yet, if you believe the ancient astronaut theory, you would not believe that that information was theirs, that it came from someplace else. See, that's the difference. Although we know all of this, the ancient astronauts, even though those theories have been discounted by every reputable scientist in the world, it still prevails throughout the world, this whole concept of the ancient astronaut theory.
What's the Maya? How do they react to all this? What's their sentiment?
They say they didn't ask us. They didn't ask us what this was all about. They made their own assumptions.
Really?
Yep.
Because there's a large population of the Maya living today. I mean, they didn't disappear like people think. They kind of got absorbed into...
For 50 million Maya alive in that part of the world. What happened with the Maya was very different than what happened with a lot of the native, the indigenous people of Mesoamerica when the Spanish came in, and the Aztecs, for example. One elder told me, he said, you know, the Aztecs were waiting for a white god to appear. We never looked for a white god because our religion didn't speak of a white god. We brought our religion here. And we didn't consider the Spanish an advanced civilization because we were from an advanced civilization. We knew what an advanced civilization was, and the Spaniards were not. Actually, he said the invaders were not. From an advanced civilization. So if you think about that, you know, that is very telling. And he went on to talk about what happened to the Maya. He said, you know, obviously it was a catastrophe befell, you know, my people. And he said whether it was a hurricane that destroyed the land, whether it was a drought or whether it was, you know, whatever it might have been. What happened is that these ancient cities that held anywhere from 50,000 to 100,000 people could no longer survive because there was no way of feeding that many people. And so the Mayas simply went into the jungle and kind of disappeared into family groups and survived on their own.
Went back to the land.
Yeah, and I think that is what probably happened. Well, recently I read an article where the scientists have said that they're nearly 100% sure that what happened is that a 100-year drought came upon that part of the world. And I think it also extended into the USA because, you know, if you look at some of the ancient southwestern cultures of the Anasazi of New Mexico and some of those, they also, you know, picked up and left their ancient sites. So, you know, it's very likely that that whole region suffered this huge drought. And the scientists are saying that it lasted 100 years.
Not only that, Ardy, the drought's closely linked with deforestation, and what they did was they chopped down a lot of forests to make the plaster for these pyramids. People don't realize how they made the plaster. They had to literally melt rock and turn it into a powdery lime. And they made this lime plaster, covered their pyramids beautiful. But the amount of forest that these guys took down to make a bag of plaster was incredible. So the deforestation.
Of course, in that part of the world, you know, it would have grown back very quickly unless it was a drought, you know.
Yeah, exactly. So
because,
I think that was
you know,
amazing.
when I would go into the jungles, you know, and I would see people who would have their little plots of land with their corn, and then the next year go back and they've moved their little plot of corn. Already the jungle has taken over. And I visited many, many sites. I mean, cities that absolutely were overgrown. And you'd see what looked like a hill or a small mountain, and it was a pyramid. But it was totally covered over with trees and grasses, and the government just hasn't had the funds, or no university has had an interest in going in and excavating and rebuilding those ancient cities. But there are literally hundreds of those throughout Mesoamerica.
Mm-hmm. Wow.
And you see, a lot of the Catholic churches, what they did is when they went in, they literally took the stones from the pyramids and they built their churches. So some of the most fabulous churches exist in that region, but they were all built with materials from the ancient pyramids.
Yeah. Oh, that's common anyway. In the British Isles, in Britain and Ireland, they took the megalithic empire and tried to convert the people, the natives, and then they even built the megalithic standing stones into some of the churches and buildings. Like, we still have evidence of that today.
Sure. I mean, that's what the group that comes afterwards does. It paves the way for them.
Yeah, for sure, for sure. What's your favorite encounter in the book, Artie?
I think one of my favorite encounters is a story I was told by an elder in Belize. He was nearly 100 years old when I met him. He approached me, and I was in an area off from Copan, and he spoke fluent English. Mm-hmm. He told me that he had been working at the site, at the Copan site there in Honduras, since he was 5 years old. And he said, when I was 5 years old, Herbert Spenden, who is the assistant curator of anthropology at the American Museum of Natural History in New York City, came here. And he said he hired me. And what I did for him is I would run and carry water to the different workers, and I would bring lunches, and he said I worked all day, and he said that they paid him 10 cents. And he says by the time he was 8, he said that Spenden told him if he would learn English that he would give him a raise. And he said, so by the time I was 8, I spoke English, and he gave me 25 cents. And he said when Spenden left, these Carnegie scientists came in, and he said they paid me 50 cents because I could speak English. And he said that one of the things that he and his cousins would do is on the weekends, they would go into the mountains to the caves, and they would look for ancient artifacts. And he said they would bring them back, and the archaeologists would pay them for them. And he said one time they went into the mountains in this cave, and they found the skeleton of a man in a silver suit. He said his suit was silver from the top of his head to the bottom of his feet. He said even though all that remained inside the suit was a skeleton, they could tell by the size of the suit. He was a small man. He said smaller than me. And he spread his hands so the skeleton would have been no more than a meter tall. Said his head was covered in a hard metal-like tube. And when I asked him for more information, he pointed to he said, do you know what a metal coffee can looks like? And I said, yes. And he said, well, it was like that. It was shaped like a coffee can. And he said, beside him was a strange tablet with strange characters on it. And he said, we knew it wasn't Mayan writing because we were familiar with Mayan writing. But this writing was foreign to us. And I asked him to tell me more information about his helmet. And he said, well, it was attached to his suit and it had a hose that attached to the front. He said there were different colored buttons on the front of the suit. And so I asked him what they did with it. And he said, well, they carried it back to the archaeologist. And the archaeologist took one look at it. And he said he heard one of them say, we have to send this back to the university immediately. And I said, well, what happened after that? He said, well, I never saw the skeleton again. He said, the next day I saw a box in a tent, and I think they packed him up and shipped him to the university. And he said, I never saw him again. And all of my life I have wondered, he said, about the Silver Man. I'm sure the scientists in the USA have studied and restudied him, but they keep it a secret. He said, I believe he was from the stars. He said, we have an old story here that the elders used to tell about people who came from the stars, a small race of men. They visited Earth, and they lived sometimes in the mountains for weeks at a time. They bothered no one, and the people left them alone. And he said there were times that you would see them. He said they came in silver discs that spit fire, and they wore silver suits. And he's saying, I think what happened to us is that we discovered the grave site of one of those little men. Yeah, and he said we carried him back, and he said the worst part of it was, he said to me, and what has haunted me all of my life, is I gave to those scientists the truth about our connection with the universe. I gave to those scientists the proof that there was life other than on this planet. And they took it and hid it away. And they know the truth, but they're just not talking about it. Mm-hmm. And he said, I will go to my grave regretting what I did when I was 10 years old. And I think his story was one of the most haunting because it was obvious to me that he was very troubled by what he had done.
Wow. Tell me about some of the characters. Who's the most memorable? Who's the one that stands out the most, either as a favorite or likable or interesting? Or...
Oh, I liked them all, and they were all memorable. It is really difficult, but I'm trying to think. I think the most memorable was a Maya elder I met in Guatemala. We were traveling. My driver had picked me up in Honduras, a new driver, and had picked me up in Honduras and was driving me, driving me from Guatemala into Mexico, not Honduras to Mexico, to Guatemala. The driver who picked me up in Guatemala to take me into Mexico, Emiliano, he suddenly tells me that he doesn't have his travel credentials to take me into Mexico. So he pulls off the side of the road and disappears into the valley below, which is nothing more than a jungle, and says he'll be back in 30 minutes. But, of course, it was hours before he ever got back. And I'm stranded up there in the jungle of Guatemala by myself. And I'm trying to think of what in the world I'm going to do. I mean, he did leave the car keys with me. When I hear horses' hoofs, and I peek out, and here is this elder coming toward me. and he's got a machete hanging by his side. He's got a rifle across the bridle of the horse. He's got a bullets in one of those carriers strung across his shoulder.
Oh, wow.
And he's riding this horse, and here he's coming up this road. And I very meekly stand up and greet him, and he greets me back, and he gets down from his horse. And he had been in the United States as an illegal alien for a few years, and he didn't like it, so he had gone back and said he had never again left his home country, Guatemala. He did not like the U.S. But anyway, he was because he said he was so lonely here. Mm-hmm. He was he couldn't find his family, and he lived alone, and he was so lonely. But anyway, I asked him, I said, my driver has been telling me about giants that live in these mountains, and I asked him if it was true. And so he began to tell me that there are different kinds of giants. And he said there's those that come from the sky, there are those that have always been here. There are, and the driver had told me that there were giants that had white jaguars for pets, and they could bite off the head of a man and spit out his teeth like watermelon seed. And he said, once they do that, your soul is doomed forever. Sure. And so I was asking this elder about these stories, and he began to tell me, when he told me there were some that came from the sky, I asked for more information. And he told me about this giant race of people who came from the sky and who had stolen women and children from the village. And so the people were very fearful of them. And so the rule was never to be caught in the jungle at night, because they always seemed to come under the cover of darkness. And so when they would see these craft come, the whole village was on alert, and all the people stayed inside. And he said, there is not a man in our village who will be caught in the jungle at night. But he was such a wonderful person, and he saved me from a poisonous snake. He gave me an herb to fruit that he said is very, very good for stamina, and he just did so many things, you know. And he stayed with me, and finally he told me that he had to go hunting. But he said, if you're still here, when I come back from hunting, I will take you home to my wife, he said. You will not stay in this jungle overnight. But fortunately, my driver came along, but he probably is one of the most memorable. I mean, you know, if you can imagine, he was very thin, very dark-skinned. He wore this white cowboy hat that really set off his bronze skin, you know. And his pants and shirt were very shabby, but he wore these cowboy boots with polished silver conchos, and I called him a caballero. And he just loved that, because, you know, that translates into literally meaning a gentleman on a horse, and is generally applied to the upper class, not to someone of his class system.
Wow. Do you believe then now bear with me on this, Artie, do you believe that the civilization of the Maya may have been interlinked or founded with an alien race? Perhaps one or two people may have come and they still invented all the stuff themselves. There might have been just some sort of a contact there in its earliest source.
Well, as I said, many of the Maya that I spoke with told me that we were the people who came here. We are the descendants of those who came here. Not one or two ancient astronauts that taught the indigenous people. So no, I don't believe that. I just do not believe that. They came with a star map, according to one person. They knew their way around the universe. They chose this planet as a place to live. and they built their cities, and their descendants continued to live in those cities for hundreds of years and practice their religion, practice their, use their knowledge, and then catastrophe struck and they had to leave them. One elder said to me, just think of this.
Mm-hmm.
If something ever happens to the USA and suddenly there is no New York City, in 30,000 years from now, some archaeologist is going to come to New York City and dig up your Statue of Liberty and say, oh, she was the goddess of fire.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
That's how people relate to us, those who come and those who describe who we are. They have nothing. They're just guessing. We know who we are. So, and we're not telling you that.
Sure. Artie, I know we focused on the Maya a little bit, you were with various ethnic groups, but what's different with the Maya and other ethnic groups that you were interviewing?
Well, their cultures are extremely different. I mean, their belief system is different. The Zapotecs think they came from the rocks. They tell stories of being the rock people. And yet they have a definite connection with the stars,
mm-hmm.
In the heavens, because, they have cities that when translated means, the house of the seven stars or different kinds of things, and translated from their language. So there's a connection there with the cosmos, but not to the extent of the Maya or the Inca, who
mm-hmm.
in South America and Peru particularly, who speak of,
sure.
They're traveling,
Do you think perhaps the Native American Indians are strongly linked with the Maya, that they originated from the same source?
Well, I think there's a possibility that some of the various tribes may have originated from that source. But I think that the Native American Indian tribes, many of them are from different groups.
Mm-hmm. Artie, we're at the top of the hour. Please take a moment to give your website out where people can get a hold of your book, and any conferences or venues you're speaking at, or any other information you want to relay to the listeners.
Well, if people are interested, they can, go to Six Killer, and that's SIXKILLER, just as it sounds, sixkiller.com, and that's my webpage. They're welcome to write me. I try to answer every single email I get, and a lot of people like to write me and tell me stories, or after they've read my book, they like to write and comment on it, but they're welcome to write me at Ardy, ARDY, at sixkiller.com. My books are available on Amazon, and so if you read them and enjoy them, please let me know, because I'd love to hear from you. And I want to thank all of your listeners out there, and thank you for the opportunity to speak to people throughout the world.
Mm.
Incidents of travel in the Yucatan, which was solely about Mexico. Catherwood had become very ill with malaria on their first trip, and Stevens took him back to New York City. And in 1841, they decided to head out to continue their exploration. And the second book was written. I was more convinced than ever, but, life has a way of getting in the way.
Oh, yeah. Oh, yes.
You have to earn a living, and you have to do all of these things as part of growing up and becoming an adult and being a contributing individual. So it really took me a long time before I was able to fulfill my dream. I started out in Belize City, which is where they first landed. But they didn't explore the country of Belize. They simply used that as a stopping off place to rest before they went into Honduras. But I chose Belize and Belize City. I stayed there and when I was in high school. I had read, a teacher gave me the book Incidents of Travel in Central America, the Chiapas and the Yucatan, by John L. Stevens, and they had gone to that part of the world in the 1800s when no one believed the ancient Maya cities actually existed. In fact, their colleagues discouraged them, made fun of them, ridiculed them for even assuming that there were cities there. But Stevens and Catherwood had heard the rumors, and they decided to head out anyway. And it was a very, very difficult trip. There were no roads, and they had to literally hack their way through jungles in order to discover, or rediscover, I should say, these cities. And I was so taken with their narrative, and when I went back to turn in the book, I said to the teacher, one day I'm going to follow in their footsteps. And she said, well, you might want to read this book. And she handed me their second book, Weather Warning Out.
Yeah, we just hear snow ourselves in Ireland here. It's on and off a little bit, but Artie, I guess tell us a little bit about the bio we don't know about you. Tell us about your passions, your interests. It's always nice to build a picture for the audience of who the person is. And tell us about you, Artie. You've got a diverse educational background, very, very tenacious in your studies.
Well, you know, I've always been an individual that I grew up in poverty, and because of that, I saw the way out of poverty was education. So I was a very studious person, and studied and got scholarships and went to the universities and you know, worked part-time jobs, often at 50 cents an hour to help put myself through school. And I've always had a curiosity about the universe from the time I was a child. And Stevens and Catherwood, who motivated my trip to Mesoamerica, was two characters I fell in love with.
Let me tell you a little bit about the author first. Dr. Artie Sixkiller Clarke holds degrees in history, English, psychology and educational leadership, and has a background as a teacher, university professor, administrator, licensed therapist and social science researcher. As a professor emeritus at Montana State University and director of the Center for Bilingual Multicultural Education, Dr. Clarke conducted research about encounters with UFOs and star people among indigenous peoples throughout the world. She's author of two bestsellers, Sisters in the Blood and Encounters with Star People, Untold Stories of American Indians. Her website is sixkiller.com, provides updates about her activities, and you may contact her at artie@sixkiller.com. Book is fascinating. Dr. Artie Sixkiller Clarke, author of this book, Encounters with Star People, Untold Stories of American Indians, turns her attention to the examination of role of star travelers, sky gods and UFO among the indigenous people of Central America and Mexico. In Sky People, Untold Stories of Alien Encounters in Mesoamerica, motivated by a teenage vow to follow in the footsteps of two 19th century explorers, John L. Stevens and Frederick Catherwood, who brought the ancient Maya cities to the world's attention, and are interested in exploring the ancient astronaut theory and ancient legends of the Maya. Dr. Clarke set out on an adventure that took her more than 7 years to complete. During that time, she made her way through Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, and Mexico, following the footsteps of the adventurous duo and collecting stories of encounters with sky gods, giants, little people, aliens among the indigenous people. Without further ado, let's bring on today's guest. Hi Artie, welcome to the show.
Hi James, thank you. pleasure to be here.
Oh, great to hear your voice, Artie. You're situated in mountain time. It must be, what, southwest somewhere?
No, Montana.
Oh, Montana. Wow. Beautiful Montana.
Up in the Rocky Mountains.
Wow, you got a wild, rugged terrain up there, Artie.
Yes, it's beautiful, though. It's going to snow tonight. We got a